When talking about the 5-day Russo-Georgian War of 2008, it's not customary in Russia to recall the preconditions for the conflict. Propagandists start their account from the night of August 7th, when the Georgian side sent troops into the territory of the unrecognized South Ossetia. However, this cynical oversimplification allows them to portray Saakashvili as the aggressor. The reality is more complex. Tensions in the region started rising in 1989, leading to serious clashes in 1991, 2004, and directly in 2008. If Yeltsin's period in power can be called a time of de-escalation between Tbilisi and Tskhinvali, then with Putin's rise to power, fuel started being added to the still smoldering hotspot much more frequently. This includes holding various congresses in Tskhinvali, asking Russia to recognize South Ossetia as an independent state. Starting from 2005, there was a mass issuance of passports to the citizens of South Ossetia. Of course, later the Kremlin would use rhetoric about protecting Russians in the unrecognized republic, to whom the Kremlin itself had issued documents. At the same time, secret arms shipments from Russia to South Ossetia started. Later, the South Ossetians would insist that all these weapons had been seized from the Georgians during the First War, although some Russian systems had never been in service with the Georgian army. And of course, there were constant exchanges of fire between South Ossetia and Georgia, each accompanied by mutual accusations of provocation. But in 2007, the escalation really started to pick up. There was an incident involving a missile launched from a Russian aircraft that landed on Georgian territory, which was documented in an Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe report. At that time, Russia often entered Georgian airspace. Many saw it as a show of force. Such actions also had a specific military purpose, to test the capabilities of the Georgian air defense system, which was being developed with Ukrainian help. Yes, that's an important point, because any ongoing war is also preparation for a war that hasn't started yet, but we'll talk about that a bit later.
Then they shelled our villages in Abkhazia, in the Kudar Gorge, and then they shelled our Ukrainian air defense system, which we had positioned above. So all of this was escalating. Our minister, Timur Yakubashvili, said, "Mr. Steinmeier, will you help us change the peacekeeping format and bring in an international component? Because we don't fully trust the Russians." He says, suddenly, he was eating this khachapuri very appetizingly, then suddenly put down his fork and knife and said, "Guys, what format are you talking about? You're about to have a war here."
Of course, Saakashvili, when he came to power in 2003, understood that if his country wanted to maintain its sovereignty in such a tense situation, there has only ever been one tool for that since the dawn of civilization: the army. That's why the transformation of the old Soviet Georgian army began immediately. The reforms primarily affected the structure of the armed forces. It was under Saakashvili that the army became contract-based and was staffed with professionals. Special operations forces were created and 5 mobile brigades were reformed. Personnel training was conducted with support from the United States and private military companies. The reforms also impacted the material and technical support provided to personnel. In addition to purchasing modern communication equipment and equipping soldiers and officers according to NATO standards, Saakashvili began to acquire new weapons, and Ukraine became one of the key partners in this matter. In addition to purchasing dozens of Ukrainian Kremenchuk automobile plant Soldat trucks for logistics, Kiev sold Tbilisi 20 self-propelled and 14 towed artillery systems. The items included 6 large-caliber Pion self-propelled artillery units that excelled in defending Kiev, 8 Mi-24 attack helicopters, and an unspecified number of Mi-8 helicopters. Ukrainian engineers upgraded old Georgian BMP-1 vehicles by installing the Shkval combat module on them, which is still relevant today. Georgia also ensured critical situational awareness in the sky and on the battlefield, a crucial aspect of modern warfare. In addition to purchasing Israeli reconnaissance UAVs, Skylark and Hermes 450 here on your screens is the downing of a Georgian Hermes by a Russian MiG-29. Georgia also purchased 2 3-coordinate radars 36D-6M from Ukraine, as well as 4 Kolchuga-M electronic intelligence systems, which at that time had truly impressive characteristics. Georgia also acquired 8 OSA surface-to-air missile systems from Ukraine, 10 modernized OSA AKM surface-to-air missile systems, and 2 battalions. And during the 5-day war, the Georgian air defense managed to shoot down between 8 and 12 aircraft, including a Tu-22 M3 strategic bomber.
The question of whose weapons the Georgian army is using to fight against the Russian peacekeepers deserves special attention. Ukraine has been in the spotlight for a long time, as summarized by our correspondent Yevgeny Rozhkov.
Experts determined that a surface-to-air missile shot down the Russian Tu-22 fighter jet. The missile was likely an S-200, which is used by Ukraine, one of Georgia's partners. It is unknown how many such systems could have ended up in Tbilisi.
It was a misconception that Ukraine supplied or sold S-200 or more modern air defense systems to Georgia. In reality, this never happened. According to some reports, Saakashvili wanted to purchase 2 S-300 PS battalions from Ukraine, but was refused. Kyiv was afraid of Moscow's reaction. This is just to say that all countries act primarily based on their own goals and are guided solely by their own interests. And this needs to be understood. The claims that the West is abandoning Ukraine are unfounded and foolish. Democracies really do behave in a criminally cowardly way, but rhetoric about betrayal doesn't help in this case. What helps is diplomacy and a balanced position. However, our focus today is on how every ongoing war also serves as preparation for the next one. The Georgians managed to shoot down a Russian Tu-22 M3 near Gori, the place where important clashes of that war took place. The reason for this success was that the Russians used a long-range supersonic missile carrier as a World War II bomber, dropping unguided aerial bombs.
Naturally, to do this, it had to enter the air defense zone and, for accurate bombing, descend to an altitude of 4,000 meters. That's the altitude at which it was hit by the Buk M1 system.
Next time, the Tu-22 M3 will be shot down by Ukrainian air defense in 2024.
The Russian Ministry of Defense reported that the cause of the crash was a technical malfunction.
At the same time, the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine stated that the Tu-22 was shot down.
Despite Russia's seeming success in the 5-day war with Georgia in August, numerous issues in the Russian military were exposed.
The primary issue is the absence of modern precision-guided munitions.
In the United States, 5 years before those events, laser-guided bombs were already being widely used in Iraq, with around 12,000 GBUs dropped just between March 19th and April 18th. The second problem, of course, was troop coordination. For example, Russian artillery repeatedly shelled their own positions. Here, listen to this.
Artillery coordinates. The coordinates are right here, along the southern outskirts.
Ours are over there, they say. I don't know, that's what they say, it's just... Give it to them! Let them fire again!
Are you sure our guys aren't there? There are none of ours there. No one is there.
As you can see, not only do Russian spotters call in strikes using a paper map, but none of them are even sure if their own people are there or not. Of course, the reason for this level of coordination was the lack of drones, while the Georgians used their limited artillery quite effectively. The proof of this is the strike on this column, whose officers stood on the road for a long time deciding where to strike, while the Russian gods of war relied solely on reports from scouts. The Russian armed forces also used drones, of course, but these were outdated systems like the Pichela 1T and Tipchak. Both could stay in the air for no more than 2 hours, and their cameras were analog, transmitting images to the ground with a noticeable delay. The Georgian Hermes 450 CS could remain airborne for 20 hours and were fitted with digital cameras featuring thermal imaging. Another key factor contributing to the disorganization of Russian troops during the war was inadequate communication, particularly in regions with challenging terrain. The Russians' analog radios, mainly the old Soviet R-163 and R-168 Akveduk, produced a very poor signal. Some sources mention that the Russian armed forces' communications were unstable because the Georgians had some Western electronic warfare systems that jammed the signal. However, that's not the case. During the rearmament of the Georgian army, no attention was paid to electronic warfare systems, and such systems were not purchased. On the contrary, it was Russia that successfully used electronic warfare systems like the R-330 Zytel. The Georgian army, on the other hand, focused on developing effective and secure communications. Digital radios from the Tadiran line by the Israeli company Elbit Systems were actively supplied to Georgian brigades, which allowed them to exchange information quite efficiently.
Units of the 58th Russian Army passed through the Roki Tunnel and entered Georgian territory. However, they had to face resistance from the Georgian army. The army column was destroyed by Georgian artillery. After that, the Prime Minister of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, flies to Vladikavkaz to personally oversee the operation.
The introduction turned out to be a bit too long for a retrospective, but it was necessary to clearly demonstrate the fact that the Russo-Georgian War revealed some truly serious problems in the Russian army. Of course, the Georgians lost in August 2008. There were quite a few factors that influenced this, from strategic and tactical miscalculations to the unpreparedness to go to war with a huge nuclear state.
Yes, in some aspects, the Georgian army reached the standards of a 21st century army, but that was not enough.
But we're not discussing that conflict. As I said earlier, the ongoing war is also needed to prepare for a future war. And here's where it gets really interesting.